He had money, power, and Lagos at his feet, but no peace. Then he met a woman who didn't bow, didn't chase, and didn't care who he was. He chose love over power, not knowing she secretly had both. This story will change how you see love, wealth, and control. Stay with me, like, subscribe, and don't blink. Lagos never slept, but that night it felt like it was watching him. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Ikoyi penthouse, Adebayo Kingsley Adeyemi looked down at the city that carried his fingerprints everywhere. The third mainland bridge shimmered in the distance like a ribbon of light, cars crawling like ants beneath the glow of streetlights, the lagoon reflecting fragments of a city that never truly rested. Somewhere below, generators hummed, horns blared, deals were struck, lives were changed, often because of him. At 38, Bayo was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in Nigeria, a man whose rise was studied in business schools and whispered about in political circles where power moved quietly and loyalty was currency. Oil servicing contracts won with calculated precision, maritime logistics companies that controlled access to ports, infrastructure partnerships signed behind closed doors with men who spoke softly but ruled loudly. His name moved doors before he entered rooms. His presence shifted conversations, and respect followed him like a shadow that never left. Men stood when he walked in, women measured their words, and enemies smiled carefully, knowing the wrong move could cost him everything. Yet standing alone in that glass palace, surrounded by wealth that could feed generations, he felt a hollowness he could not explain, a silence money had never learned how to fill. His phone vibrated again on the marble counter, the screen lighting up with a family group chat. Uncles, aunties, elders who believed legacy mattered more than happiness and tradition mattered more than choice. He already knew the message before opening it. Reminders of duty, of alignment, of the engagement announcement scheduled for the following week. He had delayed it for years, hiding behind business expansions, foreign meetings, and strategic acquisitions, but the time for avoidance had ended. This is bigger than feelings. One message read, "You are the pillar of this family." Another followed. Earlier that day, he had sat across from men twice his age in a Victoria Island boardroom, listening as they spoke about political alliances and future protection, all of it tied neatly to the woman he was expected to marry, a union that would strengthen influence, secure contracts, and silence rivals. Not once had anyone asked if he loved her. Bayo loosened his tie and poured himself a drink he did not want, staring at his reflection in the glass, wondering when his life had stopped belonging to him and started belonging to everyone else. He had been raised to believe power was everything, that sacrifice was the price of greatness, that emotions were luxuries for men without ambition. And yet, in that moment, all his billions felt useless against the quiet exhaustion settling into his chest. He needed air, needed distance from the expectations closing in on him, needed to remember what it felt like to be unseen. Without calling his driver or security detail, he grabbed his keys and left the penthouse, choosing anonymity over comfort, not knowing that a single ordinary decision that night would lead him to a woman who would change the meaning of power forever. The cafe was small, tucked between a bookstore and a tailor's shop on a quiet street far from the loud confidence of Victoria Island, the kind of place Lagos forgot because it had nothing to prove. Bayo noticed at the moment he stepped in, not because she was loud or dressed to impress, but because she was completely unbothered by the world around her, seated by the window with a book resting on the table beside her untouched cup of tea, her attention focused inward as if she had nowhere else to be and nothing to chase. He ordered his coffee and took a seat 2 tables away, instinctively waiting for recognition that never came, no widening of eyes, no hurried whisper, no respectful smile, just indifference so natural it felt intentional. When she finally looked up, it was only because the waiter mixed up their orders, and when their eyes met, there was no calculation in haze, no curiosity sharpened by status, only calm acknowledgement before she corrected the mistake politely and returned to her thoughts. Something about that unsettled him. Lagos was not a city that ignored power, yet here was a woman who didn't lean forward, didn't straighten her back, didn't ask questions designed to extract advantage. He found himself speaking before he thought, making a light comment about the waiter's confusion, expecting courtesy at least, but she simply smiled, brief and warm, and replied without trying to continue the conversation. It wasn't rudeness, it was self-containment. Against his better judgment, he tried again, asking about the book, and this time she answered fully, intelligently, challenging one of his assumptions without realizing it, her tone gentle but firm, as though disagreement was normal and respect didn't require submission. Minutes turned into conversation into laughter, and for the first time in years, Bayo felt himself relaxed without effort, no performance, no dominance, no expectation to impress. She introduced herself simply, without titles or explanations, and when he gave his name without his surname, without the weight attached to it, she accepted it without suspicion. In that quiet cafe, stripped of power and entourage, he felt strangely light, unaware that the very thing drawing him to her was the fact that she was watching him not as a king, but as a man. They met again without planning to, as if coincidence had decided to interfere, this time on a Sunday afternoon when Lagos slowed just enough to breathe, and the familiarity between them settled easily, without questions about where either of them came from or what they owned. Bayo told himself he was allowed this, that withholding the truth was harmless, that revealing who he really was would only poison something pure before it had the chance to exist. He spoke about business in vague terms, about stress, about expectations, and she listened without judgment, offering insights that surprised him, observations that cut through the noise of his world with unsettling accuracy. She spoke about integrity, about how power exposed character rather than created it, about how love could not survive where fear lived, and each word felt like it was aimed directly at parts of him he had spent years protecting. He noticed how she paid for her own meals without ceremony, how she spoke kindly to strangers without seeking approval, how her boundaries were clear without being defensive. Time with her moved differently, unmeasured by calls or alerts, and when his phone buzzed with messages he refused to check, choosing instead to remain present in a moment that felt dangerously real. Still, beneath the ease, the lie grew heavier, settling between them like a quiet third presence, because every laugh was borrowed time and every shared glance was built on omission. He knew that eventually Lagos would reveal him, that headlines did not respect privacy. And when that day came, the truth would not arrive gently. As they parted that evening, she smiled at him with a softness that carried trust, and something in his chest tightened, not fear of being exposed, but fear of losing the one place where he was finally not powerful at all. He watched her walk away, knowing he was standing at the edge of something fragile and rare, choosing silence over honesty, unaware that the lie meant to protect his heart was already shaping the pain to come. The decision reached him the way storms always did in his life, sudden, loud, and impossible to reverse. Bayo was seated at the head of a long mahogany table in a Victoria Island boardroom, surrounded by men who measured worth in contracts and silence, when his phone began vibrating endlessly against the polished surface. He ignored it at first, finishing his sentence, asserting dominance the way he always had, but the repeated buzz drew glances, subtle at first, then knowing. When he finally stepped outside, the corridor felt colder than it should have, and the moment he looked at his screen, his breath stalled. News alerts stacked one after another, his name filling headlines, his future already decided in bold letters, announcing an engagement he had not agreed to, tied neatly to a woman chosen not by love but by strategy. The article spoke of legacy, of unity, of strengthening national ties, dressed like romance but written in the language of power. There were pictures, smiling, rehearsed, respectful, captured during formal events where feelings were never discussed. He scrolled numb, realizing the brilliance of the move. By making it public, resistance would now look like rebellion, hesitation like weakness. Calls poured in immediately. Congratulations, praise, assurances, none of them asking how he felt. By the time he returned to the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted, men nodding with approval, already speaking of advantages this union would unlock, and in that moment, Bayo understood fully that his life had crossed a line where even he was no longer the final authority. As the evening fell and he drove through Lagos, his face appeared everywhere, on television screens, radio conversations, social media debates. His private future transformed into public property, and beneath the noise, one thought refused to leave him. She would see this before she heard it from him, and when she did, there would be no way to explain without sounding like every powerful man who had ever disappointed her. She encountered the truth without warning, the way betrayal often arrives, not dramatic, not announced, just sudden and undeniable. She was standing in line at a quiet supermarket, basket half full, mind elsewhere, scrolling absent-mindedly through a phone when his face filled the screen, polished and confident, paired with words that tightened something deep in her chest. For a moment, she thought it was a mistake, a misrepresentation. But as she read further, the details confirmed themselves with cruel clarity. Dates, names, family statements, political undertones woven carefully into celebration. Around her, Lagos continued as normal. People laughing, arguing, living, but her world narrowed to that single article exposing a truth he had chosen not to share. She felt no anger at first, only a deep, familiar disappointment, the kind that came from recognizing a pattern she had hoped he was different from. She finished her shopping calmly, paid without hesitation, thanked the cashier, and walked out into the evening air, letting the reality settle slowly because rushing grief never softened it. His calls began almost immediately, messages piling up with urgency, explanations forming too late, and she watched the screen light up again and again without answering, not out of cruelty but clarity. She understood power too well to be impressed by apologies once it had already spoken for itself. She had spent her life learning that men who lived inside systems always asked women to be patient with arrangements that never benefited them, and she had promised herself long ago that she would never compete with influence for affection. By the time night arrived, she had made a decision quietly, efficiently, erasing routines, cutting access, disappear with the same discipline she applied to every other part of her life, leaving behind only unanswered calls and a man forced to confront the cost of silence. Bayo had never begged for anything, not openly, not sincerely, but desperation is a way of reshaping pride when it meets something irreplaceable. He searched for her relentlessly, returning to the cafe where they had met, sitting in the same chair, replaying conversations as if memory might offer direction. He questioned Stav gently at first, then insistently, offering rewards he was accustomed to seeing accepted without hesitation. Yet this time there were no leads, no hints, no whispers willing to surface. He activated networks that usually produced answers within hours, private investigators, contacts who thrived on secrets. But days passed with nothing, and absence so complete it unsettled him more than resistance ever could. It became clear that her disappearance was not emotional, it was deliberate. Meanwhile, his family mistook his distraction for nervousness, increasing pressure, accelerating preparations, announcing dates, forcing appearances, tightening the cage under the assumption that momentum would crush out. Sleepless nights followed, his penthouse feeling larger and emptier, wealth mocking him from every corner. Because for the first time in his life, money had failed to retrieve what he wanted most. Then came the warning, quiet and uninvited, delivered late one night by an associate who rarely spoke without calculation. "You're wasting your time looking for her like this," the man said carefully. "That woman doesn't live like normal people." The words lodged themselves in Bayo's mind, unsettling assumptions he had clung to, because disappearing this completely in Lagos required more than fear. It required protection, structure, and power exercised invisibly. As he stood alone again by his window, staring down at a city that once obeyed him effortlessly, he realized that the woman he thought was ordinary might be the first person in his life who had walked away not because she was powerless, but because she didn't need him to survive. Her disappearance was not chaos, it was order. From the moment she decided to leave, every step followed a structure long prepared for moments when privacy became necessary. She moved quietly through Lagos without drama, passing through spaces that looked ordinary but were protected by systems most people never noticed. Her phone replaced, routes changed, names spoken only where silence was guaranteed. In a calm, well-lit living room far from the noise of the city center, she sat across from men and women who addressed her with respect that carried history, not curiosity, reviewing documents and updates that spoke of assets, interests, and alliances stretching beyond borders. There was no panic in her voice as she spoke of what had happened, only disappointment, because what hurt her was not the lie itself but the confirmation that even a man who seemed different still belonged to a world that demanded sacrifice from women first. She had been raised understanding power not as something to display but something to control quietly, taught that the most dangerous influence was a kind no one could trace. She listened as advisors outlined the growing noise around Bayo's engagement, the political benefits, the risks of proximity, and she responded with restraint, choosing distance over intervention. Love, she believed, should never require invisibility, and until she knew whether his choice was real, she would remain unseen. Lagos continued to speak his name loudly, unaware that Hayes was being spoken carefully behind doors where decisions were made without applause. Their reunion did not come with apologies or drama. It arrived quietly, as all serious things did in her life. Bayo was leaving a meeting one evening when he saw her standing across the street, unchanged, composed, as if absence had not touched her at all, and for a moment he thought exhaustion had created the image. She did not run toward him or accuse him. She simply waited, allowing him to cross the distance, allowing him to speak first. He did, words spilling without structure, explanations finally honest because there was nothing left to protect, admitting fear, pressure, and cowardice without excuse. She listened without interruption, then said her terms calmly, clearly, conditions shaped by self-respect rather than anger. No lies, no protection through influence, no demand for patience, no expectations that she would adjust herself to fit his world. If he wanted her, he would choose her openly, without leverage or secrecy. He agreed before she finished speaking, believing he was surrendering control, unaware that she was not testing his power but his willingness to exist without it. As they walked away separately, resuming connection without merging lives, she watched him carefully, not to see if he would fail, but to see if he would stand without the armor he had always worn. The consequences of his hesitation surfaced quickly, because in Bayo's world, uncertainty was weakness and weakness invited attack. Business rivals who had waited patiently now sensed opportunity. Contract delayed without explanation. Approval stalled. Rumors circulated in boardrooms where loyalty shifted with advantage. Political allies grew distant. Conversations colder, and the engagement that once promised protection became leverage used against him as whispers of rebellion spread. He felt the pressure from all sides, family elders tightening their grip, investors demanding reassurance, the media dissecting his silence, and through it all, he resisted the urge to reach for shortcuts, honoring the boundaries he had agreed to even as the cost became real. Then, quietly, inexplicably, the attacks began to soften. A delayed approval arrived without explanation. A rival withdrew a challenge overnight. A damaging story disappeared before publication. Bayo assumed coincidence or residual influence, unaware that somewhere beyond his view, decisions were being nudged gently back into place by a hand that did not seek recognition. As he struggled to maintain balance, the audience of his life remained focused on his visible battles, missing the silent intervention unfolding behind the scenes, while she observed from a distance, allowing him to endure pressure long enough to reveal whether his change was temporary or true. At first, Bayo dismissed the changes as coincidence, the kind of luck that occasionally followed persistence, but as the days passed, patterns emerged that made denial impossible. A government file that had been stalled for weeks resurfaced suddenly, stamped and approved without negotiation. A rival logistics firm that had launched a quiet campaign to undercut his contracts withdrew its bid overnight, citing internal restructuring no one believed. A journalist known for relentless exposés went silent just days before publishing a story that would have damaged his credibility beyond repair. None of it bore his signature, none of it could be traced back to his usual channels, and that was what unsettled him most. Bayo was accustomed to the mechanics of influence, the calls made, the favors owed, the subtle trades that powered his empire, but this was different, cleaner, quieter, untouched by obligation. He asked questions carefully, never directly, testing reactions in rooms where information usually leaked easily, yet every inquiry ended the same way, with shrugs, polite deflections, or genuine confusion. It was as though decisions were being corrected before becoming visible, like a chessboard rearranged while players weren't looking. The more he tried to understand it, the more he realized the intervention was not protecting his wealth but his stability, shielding him just enough to keep him standing without removing the consequences of his choices. Meanwhile, his relationship with her continued under deliberate restraint, no grand gestures, no merging of lives, only conversations that cut deeper than comfort, where she asked him questions no one had ever dared to pose, who he was without his name, what he feared losing more than money, whether he believed love should require endurance. He answered honestly, sometimes painfully, because pretending no longer served him, unaware that every response was being weighed not for romance but for character. Lagos continued to roar around him, blind to the quiet recalibration unfolding beneath its noise, and as Bayo lay awake night after night, staring at ceilings that once symbolized achievement, he felt the unfamiliar sensation of being guided by a force that neither demanded loyalty nor announced itself, an invisible hand that corrected imbalance without asking for credit, and for the first time, He wondered whether the woman he loved was not simply connected to power, but fluent in it. It began with whispers, the way all serious truths did in Lagos, spoken softly in places where power gathered without cameras. Older men leaned closer during conversations, lowering their voices when certain topics arose, referring vaguely to her with a kind of caution reserved for forces that did not need validation. Bayo noticed at first at a private dinner where a senior political figure mentioned a stalled negotiation and laughed quietly, saying the matter had been handled elsewhere, a phrase followed by knowing silence. Another time, an investor remarked that recent market corrections bore the signature of someone who preferred anonymity, someone whose influence moved laterally rather than vertically, reshaping outcomes without occupying space. Slowly, pieces began to align, not through direct confirmation but through absence. No photos, no interviews, no public titles, only outcomes that favored stability over spectacle. Bayo listened more than he spoke, his instincts sharpening, memory revisiting moments he had dismissed too easily, her calm when chaos erupted, her refusal to leverage sympathy, her certainty that power corrupted only those who needed to prove they had it. He recalled how easily she had disappeared, how thoroughly she had severed access, something even his most cautious associates struggled to do, and the realization settled with quiet weight. Lagos had always spoken about powerful men loudly, their names etched into buildings and headlines, but the woman now occupying its whispers existed outside that tradition, her authority acknowledged precisely, because it did not demand attention. When Bayo finally asked the trusted elder directly, framing the question as curiosity rather than suspicion, the response was measured and revealing. Some families, the man said carefully, do not announce themselves. They place people, protect interests, and retreat. Their power survived because it is never challenged. That night, Bayo drove through familiar streets that suddenly felt altered, seeing the city not as territory he commanded but as a network of relationships far older and deeper than his own ascent. The thought that the woman he loved might belong to that hidden architecture unsettled him, not because of intimidation, but because it reframed everything, his sacrifices, his struggles, his belief that he was the one choosing love over power, when in reality, power had been quietly watching him choose. The confirmation came not as revelation but inevitability, the final piece clicking into place when denial no longer served a purpose. Bayo found the documents accidentally, or so it seemed, left accessible not through carelessness but permission. They were not sensational, no dramatic labels or self-aggrandizing titles, just structured records of holdings, trusts, legacy assets, and board affiliations stretching across sectors he recognized well enough to understand their weight. Names appeared repeatedly, familiar yet rarely connected publicly, linked through silent partnerships and long-term strategies designed for endurance rather than dominance. As he read, his hands trembled not from shock but clarity, because the woman he had loved without armor stood at the center of it all, not as a figurehead but as a steward, inheriting responsibility rather than privilege. When he confronted her, there was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion, the kind that came from realizing how incomplete his understanding of the world had been. She did not deny it or apologize. She simply acknowledged the truth with the same calm she applied to everything else, explaining that her power was not something she sought but something she managed carefully, having watched it destroy people who confuse control with entitlement. She told him she hid it not to deceive him but to protect the only part of herself that belonged solely to her, the part that wanted to be chosen without calculation. As she spoke, Bayo understood the deeper irony of his journey, that he believed he was the one surrendering power for love, when in reality she had been testing whether he could love without needing power at all. The knowledge reshaped his pride, not diminishing him but stripping him of illusions, forcing him to confront the difference between authority and worth. As silence settled between them, heavy but honest, he realized this truth demanded more than acceptance. It demanded choice, public and irreversible, and as Lagos continued its restless rhythm outside, Bayo stood at the edge of decision that would determine whether love could survive the full weight of truth. The silence between them was heavier than any argument they could have had, because truth, once spoken, left no room for performance. Bayo sat across from her, the document still fresh in his mind, not as proof of betrayal but as confirmation of a reality he had never imagined applying to the woman who laughed quietly over coffee and paid her own bills without ceremony. He realized in that moment that his shock was not rooted in fear of her power, but in the uncomfortable awareness of how easily he had underestimated her, how naturally he had accepted the role of protector without questioning whether she had ever needed one. She watched him carefully, not defensively, but attentively, as if this moment mattered less for what he would say and more for what he would do next. When he finally spoke, his voice carried honesty stripped of pride, admitting that he felt exposed, not threatened, because loving her had forced him to confront the lie he had lived inside, that sacrifice made him noble, that burden was proof of worth. She responded gently but firmly, reminding him that love built on silent endurance was not love at all, that power only became dangerous when it was hidden behind entitlement or fear. The conversation stretched into hours, unfolding not as confrontation but reckoning, with him questioning everything he had been taught about masculinity, leadership, and control, and her explaining the discipline required to carry influence without letting it consume identity. She told him she had walked away not to punish him but to see whether he would choose her without leverage, without rescue, without expecting her to soften herself for his comfort. When he asked what choice remained now that everything was exposed, she answered simply. He could either protect the image he had inherited or protect the truth he had discovered, but he could not do both. Outside, Lagos continued to celebrate the engagement that still existed on paper, the alliance still applauded by elders and politicians, and Bayo understood that choosing love now would not be quiet or convenient. It would be costly, public, and irreversible. As he left her that night, walking alone through a city that suddenly felt less obedient, he knew the decision ahead would not only redefine his relationship, but dismantle the version of himself built entirely on approval. When Bayo made his choice, it did not arrive wrapped in speeches or dramatic gestures. It came through refusal. He declined appearances, rejected timelines, withdrew consent where it had been assumed, and in doing so, triggered the response he had been raised to fear. The family elders moved first, disappointment hardening into authority, reminding him of everything he owed the name he carried, the sacrifices made before him, the consequences of defiance. Political allies followed, distancing themselves with polite explanations that masked retaliation, approval slowing, protections quietly withdrawn. The media, sensing blood, reframed hesitation as scandal, spinning narratives of instability and arrogance, questioning his leadership, his loyalty, his future. Investors grew cautious, competitors aggressive, and within weeks, the empire he had built on certainty began to show fractures. Contracts were lost not through force but abandonment. Partnerships dissolved under pressure, and Bayo discovered what it meant to stand without the invisible safety net he had always assumed would be there. Through it all, she remained distant, not absent but restrained, refusing to interfere or soften the consequences of his choice, because saving him now would erase the proof of his transformation. Alone in boardrooms that once echoed with agreement, Bayo confronted failure not as defeat but as instruction, learning the cost of integrity in a system designed to punish deviation. Nights grew longer, quieter, his penthouse emptier, wealth still present but no longer reassuring, because money without influence felt suddenly fragile. Lagos, once eager to applaud him, now debated him with indifference, and for the first time in his life, Bayo experienced anonymity not as freedom but as consequence. Yet beneath the loss, something unexpected emerged, a steadiness rooted not in control but acceptance. He began rebuilding slowly, honestly, without shortcuts, discovering parts of himself that ambition had never allowed space to develop. And though he did not know it yet, the fall was not the end of his power, but the stripping away of everything that had kept it from being real. The lowest point did not arrive with bankruptcy or public humiliation. It arrived quietly on an ordinary morning when Bayo woke without urgency, without a schedule dictated by expectation, and realized how completely his life had changed. The phone that once rang endlessly now remained still, messages replaced by silence that forced reflection rather than reaction. He moved through his days deliberately, handling smaller deals, mentoring younger entrepreneurs, rebuilding credibility one honest interaction at a time, discovering humility not as weakness but grounding. Friends he had assumed permanent faded, while others he had overlooked stepped forward, offering support without agenda. In this stripped-down version of his life, Bayo learned to exist without spectacle, to value effort over recognition, and to confront his own flaws without distraction. He missed her deeply but did not chase her, understanding that love demanded patience not as punishment but respect. When they finally spoke again, It was without drama, a simple conversation marked by clarity, where she acknowledged his losses without praise and his growth without reward. She told him she had stepped back intentionally, not to test his endurance, but to ensure his change was not driven by proximity to her power. He accepted this without resentment, recognizing the fairness in her restraint, because rescuing him would have preserved the very imbalance she feared. As Lagos continued to evolve around them, indifferent to personal journeys, Bayo stood fully in his vulnerability, no longer shielded by reputation, and found that the man remaining was stronger than the one he had been. In losing everything he thought defined him, he gained the rare ability to choose freely, and as he looked toward a future uncertain but honest, he understood that the lowest point had not broken him. It had prepared him for the kind of love that could only exist between equals. Her return did not come with announcements or reconciliation speeches, because she had never believed in restoring what had not been owned. She re-entered his life the way she exited it, quietly, deliberately, without inviting attention. Bayo first noticed a shift not through her presence, but through absence lifting, a subtle easing in the emotional distance he had learned to respect, a message that did not demand response, a meeting arranged without urgency. When they finally sat across from each other again, there was no comfort in the familiarity, only clarity sharpened by time apart. She told him plainly that she had not come to save him, not to restore what he had lost, and certainly not to shield him from consequences that had shaped his growth. What she wanted now was to see who he was when nothing could be taken from him anymore. The test was simple but unforgiving. If he wanted to remain with her, he would do so without expectation of benefit, without access to her influence, without using proximity to her as leverage for recovery. His life, his rebuilding, his reputation would remain his responsibility alone. Bayo listened without resistance, because the man he had become no longer feared standing unsupported. He agreed without negotiation, understanding that this was not cruelty but alignment, because love that depended on rescue was only dependency dressed as romance. Over the weeks that followed, she observed quietly as he navigated setbacks without complaint, refused shortcuts offered by opportunists seeking favor, and chose transparency where secrecy once tempted him. He no longer spoke about what he had lost, only what he was learning, and that difference mattered more than success. For the first time since they met, she allowed herself to believe that the man before her was not reacting to circumstance but acting from conviction. And still, she did not reveal herself, because the final test was not private, it was public, and once crossed, there would be no return to anonymity. When the truth emerged, it did not arrive through scandal but confirmation, delivered calmly in spaces where denial was impossible. Lagos woke to quiet adjustments that morning, appointments rescheduled, meetings canceled, statements delayed, because something long understood privately had finally surfaced publicly. Her name appeared not as gossip but acknowledgement, attached to legacy holdings, trusts, and strategic interests that had shaped sectors for decades without attribution. Elders who once spoke loudly now spoke carefully. Politicians recalibrated language mid-sentence, and institutions adjusted posture, because a woman who had lived unnoticed among them was no longer invisible by choice. The media struggled to frame the story, unused a power that did not seek validation, and in the confusion, one detail stood out with startling clarity. She had never needed protection, endorsement, or alliance to stand exactly where she was. When Bayo saw the confirmation himself, not as revelation but public alignment of what he already knew, his reaction surprised those watching closely. There was no defensiveness, no retreat, no visible discomfort at standing beside a woman whose influence eclipsed his own. Instead, he remained steady, present, choosing partnership without performance, signaling to a city obsessed with dominance that masculinity did not diminish in the presence of female authority. Lagos responded in waves: shock, admiration, resistance, and eventual acceptance, because power, once undeniable, always reshaped narrative. Those who had dismissed her re-evaluated history, those who underestimated her reconsidered silence, and those who watched carefully recognized the rare discipline of someone who revealed herself only when the moment demanded it. As attention intensified, she addressed it sparingly, refusing spectacle, confirming only what was necessary, because her objective was never applause but clarity. And as Lagos adjusted to the truth, Bayo understood that the real reveal was not her power, but the fact that she had trusted him enough to stand beside her once it was visible. The aftermath was quieter than expected, because true power rarely lingered where curiosity thrived. With the truth now visible, the urgency faded, replaced by a recalibration of relationships that acknowledged what had always existed beneath the surface. Bayo moved through this new reality without ambition to reclaim dominance, choosing instead to redefine success through alignment rather than expansion. He rebuilt deliberately, not by attaching himself to her influence, but by standing beside her as an equal in principle, even when inequality in power was obvious. The city watched closely, waiting for insecurity, competition, or collapse, but none came, because a man who once believed authority defined worth had learned otherwise. In private, their relationship settled into honesty unmarred by illusion, built on shared values rather than mutual advantage. She did not elevate him, and he did not retreat from her strength. Instead, they negotiated life with transparency that left little room for resentment. Lagos continued to test them subtly, offering temptations disguised as opportunity, alliances framed as inevitability. But each time, they responded with restraint, choosing long-term integrity over immediate gain. For Bayo, the greatest shift was internal, the absence of fear that once governed his decisions, replaced by confidence rooted not in control but clarity. He no longer measured himself against men who chased power endlessly, because he had learned the cost of such pursuit. Standing beside a woman who wielded influence without hunger forced him to confront a truth most men avoided. Choosing love was not surrender, it was selection. And in making that choice publicly, without apology or explanation, Bayo completed a transformation Lagos rarely witnessed. A man who had everything, lost it honestly, and rebuilt not around power, but purpose. The final threat did not announce itself with violence or noise, because the most dangerous conflicts in Lagos were never loud. It arrived disguised as opportunity, wrapped in the language of reconciliation and progress, when a coalition of old allies and quiet enemies attempted to redraw influence lines under the assumption that recent shifts had weakened both of them. Meetings were proposed that appeared generous, partnerships framed as restoration, but beneath the surface lay a calculated effort to isolate her authority and neutralize Bayo's rebuilding by forcing alignment on terms designed to reassert control. The plan relied on a familiar assumption that power, once visible, would demand defense through dominance, and that emotion would cloud judgment. Instead, she responded with patience, allowing the trap to reveal itself fully before acting, because restraint had always been her sharpest tool. Bayo watched closely, resisting instinct to intervene prematurely, understanding now that timing mattered more than reaction. When the moment arrived, it unfolded without spectacle. Strategic withdrawals, regulatory clarifications, alliances quietly rebalanced, leverage exposed without accusation. The coalition collapsed not through confrontation but exhaustion, its influence drained by transparency it could not survive. What shocked observers was not the outcome but the method. No humiliation, no revenge, only correction. She used power not to punish but to stabilize, dismantling the threat while preserving the system from chaos, reminding those watching that true authority did not require destruction to assert itself. Bayo's role was equally deliberate. He did not step forward to claim credit or amplify the victory, choosing instead to support decisions that prioritized long-term balance over personal vindication. Lagos took note, because this was not the kind of power it was accustomed to witnessing. The city was used to domination, to winners who needed losers, to empires built on visible conquest. What unfolded instead was a demonstration of influence exercised with discipline, proving that strength could exist without spectacle and victory without noise. In the aftermath, relationships recalibrated naturally, threats dissolved without replacement, and for the first time in a long while, equilibrium returned not because fear demanded it, but because clarity enforced it. Bayo understood then that the final lesson of his journey was not about acquiring power or relinquishing it, but about learning when and how to use it responsibly. Standing beside her as Lagos quietly reset itself, he realized that love had not weakened either of them. It had refined them, stripping power of ego and replacing it with purpose. Years later, the story Lagos told about them softened, losing its edge as all truths eventually did when they survived time. There were no grand celebrations, no public declarations marking their milestones, only a steady presence that became familiar enough to stop inviting speculation. Bayo's life settled into a rhythm defined less by expansion and more by intention. His work focused on sustainability, mentorship, and systems that outlasted personalities. He no longer chased validation because he had learned the cost of performing for approval, and in that quiet confidence, his influence regained shape, not as dominance, but respect earned honestly. She remained as she always had, selective in visibility, firm in boundaries, choosing moments carefully, intervening only when balance required it. Together, they moved through Lagos not as symbols but as partners, understood by those who mattered and irrelevant to those who did not. Their relationship thrived not because it was protected from pressure, but because it had survived it, grounded in truth revealed at the right time and love chosen without condition. Looking back, Bayo could trace the arc of his life clearly now, from a man who believed power defined worth, to one who learned that worth defined how power should be used. The irony never left him. He had once thought he was choosing love over power, unaware that love itself had introduced him to a deeper, more disciplined form of both. As Lagos continued to evolve, new names rising, new empires forming, their story endured quietly, passed not through headlines but through understanding. And in that endurance lay the final truth, that power fades, influence shifts, but love chosen freely, without fear or advantage, was the only legacy that never required defense.